So here I have a basic setup to show you how easy it is to use Pencil Pro and how advanced you can get with it. So here I have a Suzanne. You can see I'm changing around the lighting and it's going to change around the shading and the line art, and I can update Suzanne dynamically where the position is, the rotation. I can even edit some of the mesh. So I'm going to extrude this up and you can see all of this is calculated on the fly. Before we talk about more, let's just say, how do you even get to this point? We're going to start off with a camera and a light source. How do we set this up? Well, first of all, we need a object to deal with. So again, I'm going to spawn in Suzanne, kind of rotate her to kind of face the camera, and this is the object I want to affect. Once you install Pencil Pro, you're going to see it in this end panel. However, it's not enabled. You can't click this button, and that is because the way it works is it looks at a collection and it says, for this collection, calculate what the pencil drawing would look like. And additionally, you can put in a light. So the issue is we don't have any collections. So I want to make one. Take Suzanne, turn that into a collection. I'm going to call it target. You could have as many as you want in here. I'm going to select a collection, which will now let me use Pencil Pro. If you have a light, make sure to include that light. It will look better. So once we have all that, hit Pencil Pro. It's going to take about a second, and now it is set up. You can see it did a bunch of things at once, and we'll talk about that in a second, but what I want to illustrate is it set up this effect that is already lighting dependent. Here it looks like I did a sketch drawing. If I move it behind the monkey, now you can see that there's kind of no light and it all looks kind of cross-hatched and weird. You can have a light. You can in fact even have multiple lights to illuminate different parts of it. And just so we're clear, what happened when I clicked this button is it added a Pencil Pro object, which has all these settings. We'll talk about that later. And then for every object in this collection, being just Suzanne, it applied a special material called Pencil Pro. I already used a bunch of these, so it's Pencil Pro 3. If I hide Suzanne, you're going to see only the line art, right? There is no material anymore. And vice versa, I can hide the line art, and now we just have this shading. Ideally, you have both of them. They look best together. And to change settings in the material, that is something you would do in the shader editor. And then to change the line art settings, that's going to be in the modifiers. So there's really two things to look at. You're going to see when this Pencil Pro object was spawned in, it already knew what light to use and what collection to use, and that's because of these. If I was to kind of restart this, I'm going to get rid of this and the Pencil Pro. This time I'm going to make two objects. If I want both of these to be penciled with the same settings, you take both of them, you throw them in a collection, and it's still the same collection, so I'm going to hit Pencil Pro, and now it's shading both of these, and this one actually looks really nice. So I think probably the first place to start is I do want to talk about the line art first. Inside of Pencil Pro, we have all of these settings over here. Luckily, most of them you don't necessarily touch. First two, collection and light source, no reason to touch them. You've already picked your light, you've already picked your collection. The light threshold, you're going to see that here we have a very bright, section, and that makes sense. It's facing the light. Very interestingly, you can see no lines are being spawned here. It intelligently does that. That is what light threshold is. So as I increase this, it no longer cares about that. It's just all going to be shaded. Whereas as I decrease this, you're going to see more and more of it is going to have lines removed. So you can think of this as a light sensitivity in some sense for where lines are and aren't spawned. So this is very good for highlights. Next, now that we have our objects, the next thing I want to talk about, and I put them in sections like A, B, C, D, etc., is I want to talk about the spawning. Probably the first thing to talk about is the density. If I set the density to 0, it's not going to have any lines except for the line art that it comes with. Whereas as I increase the density, it's going to spawn more and more of them. So those lines, I'm going to zoom in here, are going to have a length. So here we're making really short lines, whereas we can have really long lines. So you want to think of this as settings for brush strokes or pencil strokes in a sense. We can also play with the opacity. Opacity is just a multiplier that says take the opacity and multiply it in this case by 0, make it transparent, or by 1, full opaqueness. You're going to see three more things for spawning. You're going to see duplicates, you're going to see resolution, and you're going to see quality level. One thing that's really good about Pencil Pro that other add-ons don't seem to do is these lines that are generated, they go along the surface in a sense. So if you were to look at the curvature of a torus, it kind of bends this way, whereas for the sphere, it can bend this way and this way. They follow the curvature, okay? We care because the calculation it's doing is it's actually looking at the underlying mesh. So here we have a sphere. It's going to look at this edge flow, which means the more edges you have, the better it's going to be, which is why I have this quality slider over here. Basically, you can think of this as the number of subdivisions for the collection. So you could either have a very high resolution mesh you put in, that would be ideal, or you could subdivide it after the fact. So if I set it to 0, you can start seeing this kind of banding, these kind of plus marks we don't want. And then as I increase the quality, that will break up. And at a certain point, you get diminishing returns. Now, ideally, when you set up a new Pencil Pro, you do this whole process, but just as a bit of a cheat, I'm going to put a cube. I'm going to throw it inside the collection. And like I said, we also need to do the shading, so I'm going to apply the Pencil Pro material. Normally it handles this for you, but because we're kind of hacking it in, whatever. You're going to see that it's looking kind of strange. Like, it definitely looks pencil shaded, but you're going to see kind of these like diamonds and stuff like this. And this is happening for the reason I just said, right? The cube has no geometry to work with. So even if we add quality divisions, it can't really calculate where the edge flow is. Just the thing I would recommend is if you do this hacky thing, if you do it, I would recommend refreshing the line art to make sure you have line art on this. But my point was, you can see it's very hacky. So what you want to do is if you have low res objects, I would recommend taking them and subdividing them. And you can see every time I divide it, we're getting strokes that make a bit more sense. All of these will respond to lighting together, even when shadows are cast. By the way, one thing I noticed is when you zoom out a perfect amount, you're going to see this cross hatching. This is just like a viewport artifact. In fact, when you look at it up close, you're not going to see that, just so you know. A few more things, I guess, is we have resolution and duplicates. When I set that resolution very low to 2, you can see these are lines. When they're set to 1, there's nothing, because you need at least 2 points to form a line. This might be useful if you want a super simplistic look, but in general, the higher the resolution, the more you can get going on here. But that's also going to be some computation. Another thing that's interesting is you're going to see we have duplicates. What duplicates does is you're going to see we have this line art on the boundary. In fact, if I hide this, you can see it's really doing some heavy lifting, taking this line art and making it look good. What duplicates does is it makes it do it a few times, slightly different each time. So if I set duplicates to 1, it's just going to have one kind of fragmented line. Whereas if I increase this, every duplicate is just going to add like a round of detail. So it's just kind of sketching over yourself. So now we have lines that follow these complicated rules, but we want to talk about the quality of the line, like how thick is it and stuff like that. Each line, which is basically treated as a fancy grease pencil object. So you can see right here, it is indeed a like line art grease pencil object. Each line is rendered that way, which means it is subject to like opacity, like we said before, but also radius and stuff like that. So radius is another word for thickness. So this is how you get more of a Sharpie dark look or whatever. And additionally, you can take the radius and add a bit of variation so that some of the lines that are spawned, the non-boundary line art ones, can have a slightly different radius. This radius variation is specifically for the ones we spawned. And to me, this makes sense because usually when you draw the boundary, you use a much harsher and therefore thicker strokes. And additionally, for the shape, especially as we increase the resolutions, remember 2, it's going to be lines. For something like 6, it's going to be much more detailed. They can be a bit jagged, especially if you really increase the length and give it a lot of opportunity to kind of deviate. But what smoothness does is that it smooths it out. So every division I add, it will make it more kind of continuous. Of course, if you're very zoomed out, there's not a point to a lot of this, so you want to use that kind of sparingly. Finally, we have the randomization and overshoot section, which basically says we have this like mathematically perfect way to draw lines, and that's good, but how do we make it look more natural? How do we break it up? And by the way, they're relative to the camera, so it's not going to draw anything behind where it doesn't need to. Took a while to figure that one out. But the transform variation is basically saying each one of these grease pencil lines or curves is a object. Do I want to rotate it, scale it, move it around? And let me set both of these to 0. You can see these are much more aligned, and then as I increase some rotation variation, this is what makes it so that the duplicate lines, for example, don't perfectly overlap each other. So here is 0, they kind of overlap perfectly. And then as I add rotation and scale, you can think of this as kind of inaccuracy in a sense. Another layer of randomness is not just where is the stroke, but how like wiggly is the stroke, like, you know, is this person wigging out? That is what noise variation is. If I set it to 0, all of these lines will be perfectly straight, and that in itself is a specific art style, right? But as I increase this, it's going to basically look more jagged, and at a certain point, I would even say fuzzy. And then there's the quality of that noise. Is it low frequency, high frequency? The frequency is the scale. So if I set this to 1, it's very hard to tell anything's even going on. And then as I increase scale, which in your head you can think of as frequency, you're going to see it's going to kind of be more and more jagged. And additionally, for all of that, there's a level of detail of how discontinuous it should be. So when I set the detail to 1, it's going to be much smoother than if I set the detail to something like 4, for example. Final thing is you're going to see some of these lines do what I call overshooting. So this line kind of goes further than you would think if you were perfectly tracing this, and that is the point. I don't want it to be perfect, and that's what overshooting does. It goes a bit further. So this I'm bringing in because it has way more lines going on, unlike these that are either perfectly smooth or, you know, facetted. So if I now go into Pencil Pro and I go to overshoot, you can now see that some of the lines are going outwards, especially if I increase this a lot. So that's what overshoot does. It's basically saying, am I stopping or starting my lines later than I should or perfectly on time? I think you could also make this a negative number, you know, why not? But this will add a certain level of inaccuracy that also looks good in this randomization section. So here's without, and then here's with. With that, we've talked about one aspect of this, which is Pencil Pro the line art, right? And then I told you before that there's also Pencil Pro the material. A way to think about this is the shading, right? So you can see there's kind of this complicated shading pattern going on, and then on top of that, we put these lines. What I want to talk about now is the material part of it, but it's much quicker and easier to understand. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of Pencil Pro for now. Additionally, if you have like world or environment lighting, here I have a gray background that can also contribute to the light. So if you bring it down, you get much darker kind of shadows, if that makes sense. Just like the line art section tries to imitate how somebody would actually draw, the shader part tries to imitate how somebody would actually shade. The first one is time. Time is pretty interesting because I don't know if I already mentioned. Let me zoom in here. And this isn't probably the best for video compression, this will randomize on every single frame. So will the line art, by the way, and that is what time is for. So right now I have it by default set to a driver to keep the frame number, which happens to look really good at like a low frame rate, like 8 frames per second. I wonder if we turn off temporal reprojection. That's the trick, turn off temporal reprojection. This will randomize it on every frame. The reason I say this is you can also delete the driver and keep it constant. So now it's not doing anything. Everything I'm about to show you is screen space dependent. What that means is it's not just like a material that has grunge wrapping around it. This is what other people do. Puh, disgusting. It does it in screen space, which means it shades it as if somebody was to reach into here and draw it. They don't have access to the curvature or anything like this. It is in the space of the screen. The screen is the piece of paper. Because of that, we actually care about the aspect ratio of that paper. So in this case, I have 1920 by 1080, which is an aspect by default of 1.778. You change this number, it's actually going to change the look because it can really stretch things out or the opposite. So I would recommend keeping the actual aspect ratio. And now the next thing I want to talk about is the surface properties. The light multiplier is basically saying how sensitive in a sense is this thing to light. It's kind of the conjugate. It's similar to how we had a light threshold in the line art thing. When I set this to 0, it will kind of kill a lot of the light, whereas if I make it really big, the bright areas will be super bright. Fresnel is what recovers some of that edge detail. A good way to think about this is if I was to just add a Fresnel node like this. So you can think of Fresnel as kind of this like highlight kind of thing going on here. Fresnel is useful to capture some of these edges you can see here, and then to dictate how much of that edge, so here you can see it's perfectly invisible, as you go bigger than 1, it will capture more and more of that edge. Additionally, I try to not make it such that, oh, it's light here and then immediately it's dark, but there should be a bit of a breakup, and that breakup is defined by that roughness. So if I bring the roughness down to 0, all of a sudden you can see a super clean line, which may be what you want, but it also may not be what you want. Roughness will basically break up this line. If you bring this too high, though, it's like the light's not doing anything. We kind of have this thing I'm calling smudge. This is another screen space effect. Probably best to just show you. I'm going to take smudge. I'm going to bring it all the way up. You can see when I do that, I have this like very intricate pattern that will talk about this cross hatching and everything, but it's not broken up. It's the same everywhere, almost like we have a carpet or something. What smudge, or really it's cleanliness, depends how you think about it, will do is as you increase this, it will just kind of add a bit of roughness there as if these lines are being broken up a little. And then the rest of this is in the shading tab. So 2 things that make this up if I zoom in here. You can see we have these like star-like patterns, which I'm calling dots. So somebody just kind of like pressed a pencil over and over again. They made these dots. And then we have this grid, which represents cross-hatching. Both of these are in their own section and have their own strength. So if I turn down the dot threshold, now we're left with only these cross-hatchings. And by the way, some of this finer detail should be the smudge. That's what you're seeing there. Dot threshold is going to hide and unhide the dots. And then conversely, to get rid of the cross-hatching, you take the thickness of these lines and bring it to 0. And that would just leave this weird grunge. So I'm going to bring the smudge up to 2, so we pretty much have a clean canvas. Now, depending on the size of your paper, this might be like super detailed, right? This is what hatch scale is for. So as I bring this down, you can actually start seeing this pattern. Once we make these like ridiculous values, like let's say 10, you could see that this is really screen space dependent, right? It will follow the way I look, which is how somebody would actually draw. And I think I normally keep it at like 200. We also have rotation. So when I set it to 0, it's kind of like this perfect grid. And then usually I see hatching at like 45 degrees. And then the last thing to know about hatching is because it's pencil strokes and not perfect, I added a distortion slider that will take this from a grid, which is very unrealistic, to something that has a bit more texture as a micro detail. And again, you use this with in combination with the smudging and the dots and the line art. So you can see the cross-hatching only shows up in areas that are dark and kind of uses it as a fancy multiplier, which makes sense. If I bring the light to 0, in other words, no light in our scene, it's perfectly dark, which is represented by our cross-hatching. And if you feel like that isn't dark enough, then of course you bring up the thickness. So you're like, okay, this is what dark looks like. And then we can start adding in light back here. here. So that looks more textured in a sense. And lastly, we have hatching, but like I said, we also have these things I'm calling dots. So dots is kind of like a different style of shading where you're just kind of putting dots wherever it's dark. It's kind of like dithering in a sense. Dot threshold will basically say how intense is that effect, what are the radius of these dots. And you can see this gives a certain kind of look that's very different than with hatching. I think the combination of them is what looks good. Dot threshold, you can think of the size. Dot spacing is analogous to the hatch scale. And then finally, in the same way where we had the rotation of the hatching, we also have, in some sense, a rotation, but I call it dot randomness. If I set this to 0, you can see we have a perfect grid, which again is analogous to the hatching, whereas as I add randomness, it kind of breaks up that pattern. So already we have something that looks pretty good on its own, but then when it's in combination with the line art, game over, right? So let's just do one more object and call it done. I'm going to take a monkey. This time I'm going to subdivide it so that there's smoother edge flow. So I'm just going to, you could either apply the modifier or not, fully procedural. I'm going to put it in a collection called target in this case. I still want to use the target and the light. And by the way, I guess I didn't talk about these buttons. This one says use the light. This one says make the line art. And this one says make the material, right? So if I disable everything except make the material, it's just going to apply a material to this. Whereas if I say skip the material, it's just going to make the line art, but not the material. I'm going to do this for all of these, and let's play around with the look. So this is where I probably play with the light threshold so that there aren't as many lines where it's bright, because like this is what it was before. It was crazy. And additionally, maybe there's too many lines, so I'll bring this down to 2000, make them like more long, deliberate strokes. And by the way, a little tip, this is actually good that this happened before we finish. If you ever get overhangs, what will greatly reduce this is you bring down the length and maybe the overshoot. So if I set this to like 0.15, yeah, you can see it's starting to get rid of those because there's less opportunity for something like that to happen. Just so you know, the length and the overshoot affect that. Remember the edge flow, so it kind of knows to go around this eye, is defined by the quality level. I mean, what is there to say, you know? So you can get a lot of different kinds of looks, and anything you do here can be updated. So look, I just disable, enable, just works. Okay, longest explanation for a tool ever, but that's why it's Pencil Pro, not Pencil Basic. So, okay.